Hi, this is Viraj. Today's talk, we are going to look at Java switch expressions. This feature was introduced in Java 14, but is available in Java 12 and 13 as a preview feature. Extremely useful feature, and I'm sure most developers are going to like this. So in this video, we're going to take an example of a switch statement that you would have written in JDK 8, for example, and then improvements of switch statements that were done as part of the JDK 14, and then move that example gradually to a switch expression. And as we go along, we also will point out some of the nuances surrounding the switch expressions. So let's get started. Let's take a look at an example with a switch statement. I'm going to open a file, switchtester.java, which actually contains an example, and I'll just walk you through an example. So this is like a classic Java switch statement example. So what we're going to do is we have an enum month from January to December, and we have a method which takes in a year and returns whether it's a leap year or not, true or false. And then in the main method, we simply get number of days in a month where we pass the year and a month, and it will return the number of days for that particular month for that particular year. And then finally just print it. And as part of the testing, we are just going to use some years and months and kind of test it to see what the output is. The main method over here is actually the get num of days in a month, right? So what this does is takes in a year and a month, and it has a switch. It switches on the month, and for each cases from Jan, March, May, June, July, August, October, and December, days are 21. For February, it is 29 or 28, depending on whether it's a leap year or not. And then for April, June, September, and November, the days are 30. And then we do the classic breaks on all the cases, and then finally return the days. So a very straightforward example, which is known to all Java developers. This is the classic use of the switch statement. Now what we're going to do is that we're going to replace this switch statement with another switch statement, which is slightly better. We're going to take out all of these cases in JDK 14. The improvement is that all of these cases, for example, can be put in one single line. So let's do that. So here's the example where I put all of the cases from Jan to December out here at the top in one single line. So this is a lot more intuitive because it's also shorter, but it doesn't change a lot. One of the big problems of this case statement that you can see is that it is verbose. And secondly, the classic use of break, where if you forget to put the break, then the statement goes to the next case and it can actually cause bugs in the code. So that is still a problem. One other improvement on the case is that you can actually go and put the block curly braces out here, which represents a block. This is good as well. And the main reason is because once you use a block, then any variables, local variables that use within the block is only relevant within that case and not any other case. For example, if I introduce a new variable over here, say integer j equal to 100, that's only relevant within this particular block. If I go ahead and try to introduce a new j here, you should still be able to do that because this j in line 40 does not conflict with j in line 33. They are two separate. That was not the case in the earlier switch statement where the scope of the local variable was the entire switch statement. So that's definitely an improvement, but not as much as an improvement that we would have hoped. So now what we're going to do here is that if you notice in that switch statement, I'm going to put this back as it was. If you notice in this particular switch statement, you will see that the switch was used just to set a variable days. I mean, we initialized the days as -1, and then we set the days in each one of the case statements. So the only purpose of the switch statement was to say, for certain months, the days should be so and so, and for certain other months, the days should be something else. Now, What if the switch, instead of being a statement, had been an expression? And that's what JDK 14 does. If switch itself would return a value, then we would not have to do the setting of the days in all of these cases. So let's do that. So we have converted this switch statement into a switch expression, and immediately you will see you have new constructs out here. For example, yield. So what is yield? So what we have done over here is you will see that the switch statement, or now which has become a switch expression, is now assigned to the days variable directly. So there is no setting days before and then trying to set it inside the case statements. So the switch itself would be returning a value. How does the switch return a value? That's how the yield comes into the picture. So yield 31 would mean that for cases from Jan, March, May, July, August, October, and December, it will return the value 31, and then days would be assigned the value 31. If the month is Feb, then depending on whether it's a leap year, it would yield 29 or 28, and so on and so forth. So no break statements. You can look at it. There's no break statements over here. So once it yields, the control switches back out of the switch and into the return days. This is a good improvement, but it can be improved much further. In fact, it can be easier to write in a different way. I'm now introducing a new operator over here, which is called as the dash and then the greater than sign, which is kind of like a right arrow. So in case you're actually returning just a value, you can just use the arrow and then just put the value out there. So in this case, we don't really require a separate yield to return a value. You're just simply saying return whatever is there on the right of that arrow. This is not going to work if there's going to be multiple statements for the same case. Same thing with Feb. You can write everything in one line on the right side, and it's going to evaluate this thing to a particular value and return. There is no separate yield statement that needs to be done. So that's a good advantage where the switch expression becomes extremely, extremely short. Now, it doesn't mean that the statement on the right side should just be on one line. If you want it that way, that's good, but you might even want to put a block. For example, let's say you think that the leap year, the way we have written this, is not very intuitive. You can actually put a block out here, okay, and then you can say use a curly brace and try to do this in this way. So you put a curly brace, but you can write if yield 29, else yield 28. That's perfectly valid. So there could be a mixture of returning values directly, or if you're using a block in this case, you can put a yield statement in the place where you're going to actually return it. So there is the best of both worlds over here. So removing the yield, and in some cases using the yield, this also is much more intuitive. This definitely looks good. Let's now get to some of the nuances of the switch expressions. The first thing that you have noticed that we have used every single of the enums inside the switch statements. Now, what if you actually do not use one of them? If you don't use one of them, you will see that there's an error. It says, if you go over the month, you'll say, a switch expression should cover all possible values. Now that's good because an expression has to return a value. So what happens if the month is November? In that particular case, it has nothing to return, so it doesn't know what to do. So a compile error is appropriate at this point. So you know about it, and then you can change it. Same would be the value if in the future, I'm sure you're never going to do this, but if you introduce a new month, for example, XXX, it should give an error, or it should give a compile error. This is definitely useful so that in any future changes to your enum doesn't break any other code. One trick that you can do over here is that you can always say, I can put a default, and the default can return, let's say, -1, which is like an error, right? And on the face of it, this might seem useful, but this might also hide a lot of bugs, because if you introduce, let's say, a new month, extremely rare or never possible, but if you do that, then your switch expression is not going to give an error, and it might actually lead to some bugs. So it's actually better not to put a default in case of enums. Now, definitely, if you're using an integer, you are going to use default case in cases of integers that you have not covered in the actual case statements. That's the first. The second thing is the return type for the switch expression is determined by what that you're assigning it to. So the compiler knows that the switch return type should be of type int. If it's anything else, it should give a compiler, and we'll test that out. So if you take 31, for example, and you just change that to xxx, it should give a compiler if you hover over it, and you will see it's giving type mismatch as we expected. All of the switch expression case type should be of one type. For example, one cannot be a colon and the other a arrow. That's not possible. You cannot say, so mixing of different kinds of case statements are also not allowed. They all have to be an arrow, or they all have to be a colon, not both. And lastly, the switch expression can also throw an exception. So in cases you do not want to cover April, June, September, November, for example, I can actually just go and say throw new runtime exception, something like this, and it should be perfectly valid. So in this particular case, what we have learned is the switch expression should either return a value, either by directly using an arrow and a value, or a yield and a value, or it should throw an exception. Nothing else should be possible. Either of the two is a valid scenario inside the switch expression. So in conclusion, what we did today was to take a switch statement and then gradually change that into a switch expression. And along the way, we also explained some of the nuances and advantages of using the switch expression.